Hi there, and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. My name is Paul, and today I'm joined with Mark Techson, and we're here to talk about Angular v21. Why is now the better time to hop into Angular? Because, we've had Miko on the podcast before. We've talked about, now's the time when we're completely changing the way you do data fetching. I remember when v20 came out. So why is v21? Is it something about the way Angular is positioning itself for the future of applications? Is it fixing, if you want to call it that, some pain points? Is it a hodgepodge of everything?
Love this question. So thinking about it from a different perspective, we have been focusing on building this tool in such a way that we allow developers to build whatever they want, right? So if you want to build a small application, we have our tooling that helps you to just start generating application. And then we have been building feature after feature after feature over the last few years to make it where so we already have the small end covered, but what about the scalable application? We really want to make sure that developer experience was solid. And we think that right now, there's always, every time we release something, that is the best time to switch because we have something new for you to try. And in this case, we've released quite a few new things that meet developers where they are right now for modern development workflows. And we're really excited about some of those features.
Meeting me where I am in a modern development workflow. What does that mean for me, Mark? So is it about how I work with tools? Is it me as an individual making MVPs, or is it me working in a bigger organization? Because sometimes, we'll find Angular in those bigger organizations that have really serious apps that need to give certain guarantees. So what does that mean, meeting me as a developer where I'm at?
Sure, yes. So everything you said, and what I mean by that is, so think about the aspiration for any developer. There is, but when it comes to startups or people who are building applications with success on their minds, right? Everyone wants to scale, right? So everyone wants to be a large application at some point where they're servicing, their monthly active user count is in the hundreds of thousands, right? That's what everybody's dream for the most part. And of course, there's some people who say, oh, well, I've only made this application for me and my friends to do, our fantasy football league. Okay, fine. Then, right. So for those people, fine, right? This may not apply to them, but in general, everyone wants a scalable, large application because that means success and that means revenue. That means a lot of things for their business. So when we say meeting you where you are as a developer right now, think about how people are working. When I started this industry, oh my gosh, I'm going to date myself a little bit. 20 years ago, I started working 20 years ago as a software engineer. The tooling was the browser and the FTP server, right? Now, 20 years later, tooling is not only your IDE, not only your tooling to deploy your application to infrastructure, but now it's also AI, for example. And that's a really critical part of the modern developer workflow. People are using AI in all sorts of ways. And we on the Angular engineering team, we're trying to figure out how do we position Angular to be successful in this modern world. So we're releasing things like the Angular MCP server, the Angular AI tutor. We have the Angular extension for Gemini CLI, right? So we're doing all of these small things that we hope to have a big impact, but they are meeting developers right now where developers need good tooling, they need AI-powered tooling, and they need a framework that scales, and we think that we meet those criteria.
Gotcha. Okay, I think I'm getting what you're picking up, what you're putting down. So I could use a variety of different AI tools. I could have a variety of different places where I want to insert myself into the app. And with these tools, I could do it here, I could do it there. It's neither here nor there. It's where I'm at. So when we're talking about MCP servers, when we're talking about plugins, especially with AI tool, and that's a popular topic these days, there's this fellow that I saw on a YouTube video talking really succinctly, and I like the way he kind of framed what is value in today's day and age of tooling. And the value is your context and memory management layer that you can insert into these tools. It's how you cut through the cruft and really allow people to get the answers and information they need without mess, without having a clean slate every time. That intelligence, that context, that memory layer, that's the secret sauce that really pushes a product into something that sticks or not sticks, as whether it be tooling, whether it be an app, whether it be an UI. So I'm curious how you guys are approaching that. Is it purely out of MCP and just saying, hey guys, you can go query all this documentation? Are you putting forth opinionated workflows on how we test, changes in how we test? How exactly does that translate into a way that doesn't make me scared of, oh my gosh, there's more tools and now there's like more context I need to manage, because that's really where the intelligence is. So I'm curious how the team's been thinking about that.
Here's what we've been thinking about and doing in terms of how we manage that. First thing, on angular.dev/AI, we launched a bunch of context files that you can include in your development workflow. So whether it be for Cursor, whether it be for Firebase Studio, whether it be for places like Antigravity, like wherever you want, wherever you're working, we provide those context files that will give you the LLM the context for how to build like modern applications, and then with some notes on how it, what features to use, how to do things, some best practices. Now, here's the interesting thing, at least what I think about how those best practices work, is that those best practices were not just us guessing. Those actually aren't guesses. Those are vetted through a tool that we also released recently called the Web CodeGen Scorer, which was an evals tool that we made in open source, and it's not only for Angular. You can use it for any framework. Well, I'll say you can configure it for mostly any framework. We don't know what the full scope is, right? But like we've seen it configured for Solid, for example. The Solid team tried it out and they configured it. And what it allows you to do is to measure the quality of your like context file, right? Your best practices file. And then you can track regressions. For example, if you release a new version of your framework and then you start to see that, when you generate these 200 applications and run the eval system, you can say, whoa, something went weird. Let me check this context file that I have. Right. And then, so that's how we're thinking about it. So this is evidence-based versus like, here's just us taking, because remember what people were doing, and this doesn't feel like that long ago, but it was only like 6 months ago where we were doing LLMs.txt. Everyone was doing this, and they were taking their entire documentation and trying to distill it down into a bunch of bullet points and feeding that as your context for your context window, right? That was only 6 months ago. That shows you how fast this entire industry is moving, right? So in the last 6 months, we like really changed the way we work. So we saw that was like one way to work, but we thought we could do better, and this is how we thought we could do better.
I mean, the framework of detecting regressions and putting them back into your context is huge. Like that is a game-changing workflow, me personally, that I had to put hours and hours and hours and hours of work into for one project. And I was like, okay, for this project, here's how you know if like something's good, something's bad. And once you get it going, it's great. It's you can kind of get more hands off about some of the dirty things you don't want to think about. But I don't want to do that for every project. And so this set of tools, they help me keep that opinionated, stateful store, what's working, what's not working, the testing of my my memory and my project context over time. It's a framework to help me as a developer tune that and stay up to date. Okay, very cool.
Right. And these are early versions of it, so we're hoping to improve it over time to give you even more flexibility and functionality in it. But you could do it for React, you can do it for Svelte, you can do it for Angular. Like you could try out the Web CodeGen Scorer. It's open source. Like this is something that we just saw a need for, and we just made it.
All right. Well, now moving on to like some ways that I might use that in Angular, some new features, some new bells and whistles that we might want to touch on. Tell me about signal forms. I don't know what a signal form is. I know what a signal is, and I know what a form is. Mark, what is a signal form? Why is it big news?
So for our friends at home, if you're thinking about signal, so you said you have a React-heavy audience. So if this were like a solid JS audience, they were like, oh yeah, signals, we know all about this. Well, for people at home, a signal is just a variable, a data point that can notify interested parties whenever that data changes, right? So that's what the idea of a signal is. Now, think about taking a signal and having your data model as a signal. So you have your form and you say, okay, I'm going to model my form as a signal. And then you can combine that with what you do currently with forms. So the reason this is a big deal is because now we're allowing developers to bring their own data model to like the form system. And Angular form data in general is annoying for most frameworks. It doesn't really matter what you work in. Form data is like a hassle to work with, because how do you keep things in sync? What if you change the data model, right? But then the form doesn't represent those changes yet. You got to like bind manually. You got to do all this reconciliation with signal forms because it's reactive and it's based on signals. You literally can say, okay, well, look, if this data model changes because it's bound to our form, it's reactive. I don't have to do any manual reconciliation. No manual reconciliation. That is just the nature of signals being reactive and updating the form model because it's the same. So the signal form, when you bind it to the certain signal model, when you bind it to a form, that locks you in. And then you have all these really nice functionality that you can do, like custom, you can do like validation, really straightforward, do custom validation. I mean, you can do custom form controls. And we've tried to make this as ergonomic as possible for developers by removing a lot of the pain points from our previous iterations on form data. So this one is a big deal because we're really excited about how we can remove the pain that developers were facing and trying to solve this problem previously.
Yeah, forms are a debacle because every framework does it a little bit differently. Mm-hmm. And then we've gone through this transformative last like 5 years of, do you do it all on the client side? Do you do it on the server side? How does Signal Forms help sort that out? What is client side validation, server side validation, and how does that tie into the binding of the model?
Signal Forms work on the client side now, but because it's just a signal, you could pass that signal to your server, you know, as your normal data and you should always do both, right? You should, because validation is just a fence, right? So you try to build a high enough fence to keep your data with integrity. So on the client side, you have validators that you can implement, and then you could do the same thing on your server side.
So it's client side by default for free. Mm-hmm. And then if you want to take the signal server side and do extra stuff and build a higher fence, you just listen to the signal, pick it up, and then you can write whatever you might need for that server side. Awesome.
Yeah. Okay. What you would normally do, you continue that story, 100%.
Now, moving forward, do you guys see Signal Forms as the de facto singular way to do forms? Would you recommend people start migrating forms in an attempt to have that coupling typed and strongly held together so that it can be maintained, or just keep things how they are, start building Signal Forms as you move along? What does that migration look like for teams?
Right now, we are in experimental mode. So we're asking developers to try out the Signal Forms APIs, but we also are saying like, hey, ideally, once we mature this solution enough, we want this to be the default that you use for your form data, because it takes the best parts of we have something called template-driven forms, which is like a very low barrier to entry form system. But it was really based on like binding through the template, and then the data model, it was a little bit looser. But then we had something called reactive forms, which were strongly typed, but they was much more complex, right? And that's the thing that we've always kind of, I won't say, how can I say this? We've always kind of had to work around some of the complexities of Angular. Like, we've been working really hard to make it less complex in some areas. And this is another step in that direction where our reactive forms are strongly typed. You could do a lot, but it was kind of hard to do. And we just still think like, okay, you know what? There just has to be a better way. And this is a better way, we think.
Do you think signals are going to be a theme of the Angular team moving forward in terms of reshaping some features, adding to that ergonomics as a fundamental primitive?
100%. I think that we've already started to do that, where we've replaced things like, so in React, there's like props that you can send down. So like our version of props we call inputs. Like our inputs are signals, right? So that's like a good example of how we are taking signals and putting them in all the places that make sense for signals to be, and to reduce like toil for developers, right? And reduce friction and pain. Right. So we're doing that wherever it makes sense, but not forcing it to places where it doesn't make sense. So like, that's a really important distinction to make.
Where's the spot it doesn't make sense? Sometimes the negation of painting a picture is the most important.
Yeah, let me think about that. What's a good place where it doesn't make sense? You know what? Here's a good place that doesn't make sense. Anytime you have an unpredictable stream of events, it doesn't really make sense for that to be a signal, because signals don't have a concept of time. So that should be an observable, because you don't know if or when something's going to happen. So that should actually be like an observable, like RxJS style, like observable, right? So you really wouldn't want that to be a signal. However, we do feel like your state, for example, well, you have a lot of control over your state. And then if your state changes, you want to update it everywhere. I mean, like React is like really great about this, right? When you update your state, you say, okay, set state, and then everything updates, right? And so that makes a lot of sense from a design pattern point of view of your state modeling. And so we think like signals make a lot of sense. So you update the signal. Any parts of your application that are dependent on that signal should be notified that there have been changes versus the pattern of you having to say, well, did something change? If something changed, let me make updates in my application. Well, that's a little bit more, challenging.
The comparison to the observable really sealed the deal for me. That was a good one. I appreciate that. Moving on to like UX stuff though, at the beginning of the podcast, I kind of told you like, hey, this might change how you like work with your UX team. I mean, everybody's changing how they're working with every team in 2025 because our tooling's changed, like you pointed out, Mark, like so drastically. But here we're talking about Angular specific ways that you could enable faster collaboration in your team. So things like Angular Material. What's going on with Angular Material? What's going on with Aria, Angular Aria? How does that change how we design components? Does it change how we design components and inversion our UX on top of the APIs, on top of forms, and build out those experiences?
I actually love Angular Aria. So let's talk about what Angular Material was. There's the material design spec that we adapted for Angular, and we gave you a set of components that have some functionality in them. And then you can put those components in your application, and then you don't have to build things out like tabs, some fancier drop downs, things like that. And all that was great. Like all that was great, except for what we found from developers is that it was a little bit challenging to apply your design system if you did not want the Angular Material look. How do I apply my design system if I don't want the Angular Material look? So Angular Aria is a step in a different direction where Angular Material came with styles. Angular Aria ships with no styles. We call these headless components. So when you render it to the screen, sure, you will see a component, but it's an unstyled component. It doesn't really match the theme of anything. It doesn't have our opinions on it. It's very basic. So think about it being like almost like a wireframe version of a component, but not that bare bones, but pretty close, right? And then we give you the ability to bring your exact styles to it, your exact design system, and then you can style these components. They can look however you want because we're not bringing styles. You bring the styles. But here's what we do bring. We bring accessibility patterns with Angular Aria and these headless components. So accessibility has to be at the top of your application design needs because the application needs to work for everybody, right? People use the internet in very different ways. It has to be able to work for everybody. So we're saying here are 13 popular, or I won't say popular, let's say common design patterns, accessibility design patterns. We have some components that encompass that. And they're all Angular Aria components, meaning you can use these components like a toolbar, for example. You can take the toolbar. You can say, okay, I can use the basic one. It looks fine, but it doesn't really have any style to it, but it looks fine. Or you could apply your own theme. Or you could do like we did on Angular.dev. We applied a retro theme to a bunch of the components just to show how it's possible for you to create the styles for this thing. I mean, like this is really, really fun for developers to be able to be creative now. And then they still get the power of the Angular Aria accessibility layer, but now they get the flexibility of their own designs.
Got it. So this is like a ton of boilerplate I would have to write otherwise if I was reaching for like a shad CN set of components and I put them on my app. Things like accessibility, how they bleed together, and make sure that we have clean state interactions. You would all have to think about from the ground up. So if I can pull from this wireframe, it's almost like a ghost component. I can think about it.
Sure.
If I'm picking up, and then you put on your own skeleton, your own phenotype. And how does that get assembled? How does that get versioned? Does it change like having a UX team having component library that they version or Storybook or something like that?
You could do whatever you want there. I think the way that we've seen it in early days is that developers, if they get their design system and they design for those components, you do your styles once. You don't have to keep redoing them, right? You do your styles once for the components, and then people can just start pulling them into the application. Right, like that's the workflow that we're imagining for people. And then if you do Storybook, for example, I'm not as familiar with Storybook. I mean, like using it, I know what it is. I haven't really used it, but I can imagine you having Storybook for your components and then your design system applied there, and then you can see these Angular, like the Angular Aria components or whatever components you build on top of this, right? Like if you use it as a building block to combine a bunch of things together to make something. Like, you get to do what you want to do, right?
Do you guys think that components should exist at this level, which is like we have the skeleton, we have your accessibility thing sort of primed, and now you guys can work with the UX team? Is that the way components should be done? Because still today, Mark, they're pretty primitive. I mean, you can go just grab code for a button, bring it into my app. I could go reach out to one of the hundreds of UI libraries and just bring it on in. But this is a more like tiered system, sort of. It's kind of a shift in how we think about doing UX, and you guys are kind of have an opinion about that here. So it's interesting. I'm curious how this might affect like teams and workflows and size of teams, if that at all. If you guys have put any premeditation behind that.
Sure. So think about where we're pulling our ideas from and our motivation. So we're listening a lot to the Angular community and what the needs of the Angular community are. And a lot of those needs are around this idea that developers needed a way to have accessible components that they could style, based on their systems at work. So if you look at something like a ShadCN or Bootstrap or any of these other great component systems, they have a look to them, which is fine. But what happens when you want something different? I don't know what that answer is, right? But you have to do some work, right? If you want something different. And what we're saying is that, like, okay, so for the teams, if you want to use, like, you could technically style the Angular Aria components like ShadCN if you wanted to, because we don't bring any styles. You see, so if you like the ShadCN look, then yeah, sure, find that style sheet and apply it to the components, right? Like, see, this is where like the AI, like workflows can really change the way people work. Because I could imagine a world where we give you the sample style sheet, like what are the definitions that you need to style this component, right? In full. And then you could give that to like to Gemini. And then you can say, Gemini, here's the styles that I actually want. Can you give me a version of this? And get pretty far, I bet. Like I bet we can get pretty far and say, oh yeah, now the Aria components look like ShadCN. And I use Gemini to get me a lot of the way there. Right. So like the way we're offloading some of the work, I think this just benefits developers in a lot of ways, because now if you use like AI tooling to help you, some of the pain points of building those styles, they kind of go away, because some of the work is just building the style sheet itself, right? Like
Totally.
That's a lot of that work. And I can imagine designers being like, okay, look, I already know what colors I want. I know what my primary colors are, secondary colors, what are my extra colors, the third color, and then say, okay, now convert this, and then I'll take it from there, right? And I'll fine tune it to get it to where I want, right? So there's just a lot of possibility.
What about testing? If I have and we can think about this from a UX perspective.
Sure.
People have their ways that they might go about end-to-end testing and making sure that styles are transpiling correctly, make sure that things are being bubbled up as they would plan. We're talking about changing the fundamental way that we might run tests and write tests with Angular right now, as far as I understand it. And we're talking about Vitest.
Vitest, that's right.
Yeah. How does this, and we can start from the UX perspective, does this bleed into the way that these tests might be handled, written, run, maintained? And follow up, of course, just talking more broadly about Vitest and what this means developing with Angular.
If you're doing end-to-end testing, right, and you're testing in a browser, you can totally test your components. You can test your interactions, right? And then you could also check our test that we wrote for these components, to see and make sure that these things are working. So you could look, because everything for Angular is open source. So you can have a look and see how we tested the components. But if you want to test your additional interactions, you can totally do that. And Vitest is a really interesting part of our story now, because we had at one point we had an in-house solution that we made at Google, Karma, that we made at Google, and then we like donated it, I believe. I think, don't quote me on that one. I think we donated it publicly, and then we started working with other like testing solutions. And then we decided to think like, okay, again, remember I talked about meeting developers where they are. Right. A lot of developers use Vitest. That is just the way it is. People like the tooling there. They like the solution. And we don't want Angular to be an outlier in that space if developers are really being productive and shipping meaningful applications. We want to make sure that we are a part of that regular story. People can feel like, oh, Angular's not weird about this. I can use Vitest here as well. I can bring my skills that I learned from another framework with testing with Vitest. I can bring it over to Angular. And so Vitest is a really great new addition to the story.
Was this a long time coming in the ways that you guys were chipping away at making sure everything would fit nicely with Vitest, or was this a big v21 scope that the team worked on?
No, this is a thing that we had talked about, and we had been kind of thinking about it, and we have been doing it as experimental for quite a while, for at least a year. At least a year, it was experimental support. But the thing that was holding us back is that we don't like to leave developers behind. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the Angular story over time, it always includes this idea of bringing developers with us. So there's either some type of thing like a schematic, which is just like a modernize or update like tooling that we have. We'll usually release a schematic to help you say, so if we change syntax, we'll release a schematic that will help you to use the new syntax. So that way you're not left behind. Right? We try not to ship breaking changes, for example, with Angular. We really try to ship it where it's like, okay, we want everyone to still be successful. So let's see what we can do here. With Vitest, the one thing that was holding us back was the browser mode, right?
Right.
Browser mode only got, I think, stabilized recently for Vitest. And once they finally stabilized and productionized their browser mode, that gave us a way to do it, because we couldn't say, well, go to Vitest for all your unit tests, right, and integration tests, but don't do your end-to-end testing in the browser, or don't do real testing in the browser. Right? Like that's not a complete solution for people. So once we got that solution, then we were like, okay, we're able to do it.
I was going to ask, like, what was one of the main motivators to push towards Vitest? But it's the common theme I'm picking up here, which is you guys on the team are really centering around what do developers tell us today? And then you plan based on that to meet developers. Something like Vitest, right? You didn't even roll it in yet because it wasn't ready. It wasn't ready. I think a lot of
our developers specifically.
Of your developers, yeah. Interesting specification there of your developers, because everything moves quickly in this industry, and we talked about that. It's just interesting to note because people are certainly feeling fatigued of tooling changes, getting rugged by things that should be there and not there anymore in a framework that is their day-to-day job. Sounds like you guys are very callous to doing that. Really like centering around what are people asking for and sticking with something that's maintainable. I guess that is your motivator move towards Vitest. It is where developers are. You want to bring it to developers, and you did it now because now's the right time when it's stable enough and it's complete enough to do so.
That's right. And okay. Again, this isn't me saying that like Vitest was not complete. I'm saying the way our developers expect it to be able to, like, if you're going to migrate developers off of a solution into a new solution, it should have parity in the way that developers are working, because then that's how you get a lot of developer like unhappiness, which makes sense. I would be unhappy. You would be unhappy if you got forced into a new solution that didn't work the way you needed to work for the way, or based on the way you expected it to work, right? So that's what I mean by that. So like, that isn't me saying like, oh, our developers are so sophisticated they couldn't use Vitest. We're saying we didn't have the browser mode support that we needed to make it our solution. And because that's what our developers needed, was the browser mode. Right. And then once it was stable in production, then we said, okay, that was the last part of the story.
There's always this element, and excuse my obtuse language here. There's an element of, when we do the Angular podcast and the React podcasts centered, or the Svelte ones, you could throw them in. On React, it's like, oh my gosh. So what happened last week? And then there's this element of Angular, and when we've had Miko on and folks, they say, well, people come to us and they go, React already has this. React, or like Next.js does this. Why doesn't Angular do this for me now? Do you find that there's some friction coming from the external communities who you wouldn't lob into like our developers immediately, of like inbounds of like, oh, okay, but does Angular do this? And you're like, listen, guys, we're not doing the shoot at the hip sort of like everything changes every week. And you are kind of playing defense on that in order to retain this like, change set that is palpable, that is okay for developers, that doesn't create this like parting friction that could end up having people drop off. Is that
Yeah.
something you
So
folks need to manage? Yeah.
this is hard in general for any framework maintainer, for the maintainers of React, maintainers of Svelte, the maintainers of Solid. Like everyone has the same problems, which is like, how do you ship the right features for the people, right? Like that's really hard to figure out, and we're doing the best that we can to decide, okay, what's important and what's not important. And we hope that we get it right. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we don't get it right. Sometimes there are things that we're like, oh, you know what, we should actually have done this sooner. You know what I mean? And then some things we're like, oh, we did it at the right time. You know what I mean? And so it's just a balance that we're trying to strike. And we are very human at Google. That's one thing I like to remind people. We are not genius robots who never make mistakes. Obviously, we're very human. And so we're doing the best that we can to ship the features that empower developers. Right. And everything is great. That's the other thing to think about, Paul, is that everything is great. Like Svelte is great. Solid is great. React is great. Angular is great. Vue is great. You could probably take all those tools and get out there and build like a wonderful application. There's no doubting that. Like we're past that time in the like framework timeline. You know what I mean? Where it's like, well, I can only use Angular because Angular is the only one that can do this, or I can only use React because React's the only one that can do that. We're past that time. All the feature sets are pretty common. We all talk and share ideas. We're inspired by one another. There are cool things that Angular does. What the real thing is, what can you do to make the story the best for your developers? That's what the real focus is. So what can React do to make React the best for React developers? How do we keep React developers happy? Same thing with Angular. It's like, how do we keep Angular developers happy? People may choose Angular or not. And like, we just passed that time of, well, we have to get every developer. Like, if people see a value proposition in our way that we've decided to solve problems, then welcome to the party. We have a lot of cool stuff, but everybody has a lot of cool stuff. So you just have to decide. You can't really make a wrong choice these days. And the choice then comes, does the tooling and the experience fit the way that you work and what you need?
That's why I love asking about like the Aria components, because it does kind of paint this niche picture of one aspect of the multiple things that are coming in V21, which is this might change how you do UX work completely.
Right.
It might change how you think about modeling. It might change how you work with your UX team. And does that work for you? Hearing that experience or hearing how you guys change that really makes me think about my experience if I were to use that. So that's interesting here to hear you too as well say, Mark, that we got great toys everywhere. Mm-hmm. It's about matching the style of the work of how your team might be designing it, how the React team might be designing it to my team, to how we're building the product at hand. And that makes more sense of why you said our developers as that clarification earlier, right? You're trying to be very intentional. Very intentional.
Well, because if you're trying to build for the win, so to speak, right? If you're trying to build for the win, like I'm trying to build a framework that's going to like defeat all other frameworks. Like that's just not where we are anymore. You know what I mean? Like we as an industry, we're just not there anymore. Like the real battles are happening at a different layer now. And the framework is becoming, like just a different focus. It's becoming a different focus. Because think about vibe coding. Think about how 3 years ago, you couldn't describe an application and make it come to life, right? Or if you use like a WYSIWYG editor, you could like use a Shopify thing, for example, to like make a website, but the logic was whatever logic it was created. You know what I mean? And whatever plugins you can get. Now you can describe to a large language model almost any application that you want. You know what I mean? Like, and then there are people out there who are building now who don't even care about what the code looks like. They've never even seen the code. So it's like,
it's wild.
It's a different world. So now how do you fit in that world as a framework? And that's what we're really interested in. It's like, okay, well then how do you fit? That's why I said the whole AI tooling thing is really important. How do you fit into the world where people write applications differently? And we're taking, what I like to call like a very advanced step forward versus like letting anything happen to us. We're charting a course Like, okay, well, we think developers need MCP servers. We also think that they need, context files. We also think that they need things like we have our AI tutor, which is really rad that one of our engineers made. My colleague Devin, he made a tutor that you could like ask it about your code base, and it can teach you how to work in your code base with Angular. Like, that is just cool.
That's huge. And that's huge for like if you're starting a new project or you're bringing on people that have never used Angular. Like, look at my project, learn how to use my project. It's really powerful as a lead to be able to give somebody that tool and just tell them to like, hey, ask me questions after you use the tool. Dive in, be curious,
That's right. And if you don't know Angular, that's fine, because it's going to teach you Angular. But you see, it's like you could link it to your project. It could read the context of your project, and then so you can develop lessons on how to do. I mean, there's just a lot of things that we're trying to think about, like the Gemini CLI extension that I recently made. I was the lead on that one, and we recently released it. Like, people are Okay, I never thought that people would want to work with an LLM from the command line. Never thought that was a thing. And I was completely wrong, right? Now Gemini CLI is out there, Claude Code is out there, like all these tools that are command line based tools that you work popular with LLMs, right? But now we noticed that there's a shift in the way developers are behaving, and so we released the Angular extension for Gemini CLI. So now you can get the Angular extension in your CLI environment, and now the CLI knows even more how to work with Angular. You see, so like these are all like the type of things that we're thinking about with like being, really AI first and AI forward with Angular.
Do you guys have talks or anything on YouTube? And before you answer that, I would love to close out with something that we didn't talk about, Mark, that excites you. They feel like the team really killed on a feature, did an amazing job.
Sure. Defer syntax is a special feature. It's template level lazy loading, not at the router level. I mean, parts of your template you can request from the server, and it's like super simple syntax, but really advanced like functionality. And you could define all these guards and triggers. So like, oh, if this comes to the viewport, request this part of our template, not of like, you see what I'm saying? Like,
okay, of the whole layout, yeah, of like
just like this little part you can request, and then we have incremental hydration, which is built on top of that, which you can hydrate parts of application, but not the full screen. I mean, we have a lot of really cool like optimizations there. Check that stuff out. If people want to find out more about Angular, go to angular.dev. Definitely go to the Angular YouTube channel and watch that mini movie that we put out. It is unlike any other developer release video you've ever seen. We put a lot of heart into it. It's a lot of fun, and it's a big throwback for us who grew up playing games in the 90s. It's just a really, really, really fun thing. And you can always search for Mark Techson, Techson on the internet. You'll find everything about me and Angular if you search that.
You're the Angular man. Search up Mark Techson, and we will link the video in the show notes. So if anybody's listening and you're like, where do I get this video? We'll have it down below. You can click it. We'll bring you right there. Mark, it's been a pleasure. You've been an amazing guest. It's been great to learn about Angular v21. These sound like huge features, big changes that are going to really enable like the 2026 years of Angular apps coming out. So thanks for your time again and humoring us.
All right. Thanks for having me.